In this video, we're going to see how to use Retrofit to easily read and parse JSON into a POCO, a plain old Kotlin object, or a POJO if you prefer, a plain old Java object. JSON is a fairly common syntax that we see now, especially on mobile, because it's an easy way to get data from a different source and integrate it into our mobile application. This is a look at the JSON feed that we're going to be integrating here. It's essentially a unique list of genus, species, and cultivars from the plantplaces.com website. If I take a look in the JSON viewer, I can hit Viewer, and we see we kind of have a top-level object here called JSON, then an array called plants, and then under each of these, we have the attributes of a specific type of plant. In this case, I'm only looking at oak trees, or plants with the word oak in it to be more precise. So I have about 50, well, it looks like about 62 unique plants, 63 unique plants. But what we'll see is they all have an ID, genus, species, cultivar, and common name, just like so. So we want to read this easily with Retrofit. Retrofit's a library that we can use to make JSON parsing a lot easier. I have another video where I do it in Java, so in this video we're going to do it in Kotlin. First of all, why? It puts into a black box a lot of the manual processes that we used to have to do with JSON parsing, so we don't have to worry about spawning up a thread with a sync task. It handles all the network connection. It also handles the parsing. We just have to follow a few simple guidelines to get it all to work. First, let's add some dependencies to our project. I have them listed here. I'm going to go ahead and paste them into our build Gradle file. So I navigate to the build Gradle file in our app folder, and I simply paste those 3 dependencies and save. While I'm here, I also want to remember that I need a permission, so I'm going to double shift and look for Android manifest. Let's spell it right. There we go. And at the very top of this, I need to include a uses permission statement. So uses-permission. And then we'll say Android name, Android permission internet. You see it's the first permission there. It's a common permission, so we don't have to do all the just-in-time magic. We can use it just like so. Next, we need to make a map of the DTO and list that model the JSON data. This one's a little bit tricky. So first, let's look at the JSON data. We know we have an ID, genus, species, cultivar, and common, and this belongs to something we'll call a plant or a plant DTO. So let's start with that. I'll navigate back to my application. I probably should make a package for these DTOs. As a matter of fact, probably not a bad idea. So let's go ahead and make a package, and we'll say DTO. Just make a little sub-package here. And I will move my specimen DTO in there. I made that in a previous video. Refactor, just make that a bit cleaner. And then I'll right-click, and I'll say New, and we'll say Kotlin file or class. We'll call this one a class, and we'll call it plant DTO, and OK. Now, add to Git, that's fine. And we're going to make this a data class, which means it's essentially a DTO. That also means it needs to have a constructor. So we will start by saying var, and then I think we had plant ID, colon, we'll say int, and we'll initialize that to 0 if it's not passed in. Then var genus, colon string, var species, colon string, var cultivar, colon string, and finally var common, colon string. So we have the attribute, and we follow it with its type. Let's just make sure this matches what we saw in the JSON. Looks like a close match, although ID I have as ID, not plant ID, so I can go ahead and, for convenience, I can just change that to ID like so. I can also use a little, some attributes to map that and say what it actually does map to, but this is good enough for now. So I have a plant DTO. There's one other thing that we have to consider. This is a little tricky. Notice that the top level element is not an array of plants, but actually an object which owns that array of plants. So we also have to make a class that represents this object which owns a collection of plants. It's a bit subtle if you're not looking out for it, but curlies essentially indicate an object, square brackets indicate an array, or in other words, a repeating data set, and we have to start all the way from the top when we're using Retrofit. So let's make another new DTO. I'm going to say new, and we'll say Kotlin file or class, and again, we'll call this one a class, and this one we're going to call plant list. So it simply represents a list of plants. Okay, go ahead and add to Git, and just a moment. So for the plant list, we're going to make this a DTO as well. So we'll start by saying data class plant list, and then because we've said data, we have to give it a constructor. So now I'm going to say at serialized name, and then in parentheses plants, and then we're going to say var plants list plant DTO. Okay, what's going on here? First of all, let's make sure we can find the serialized name. And we can't right away, but there's an easy answer I've been ignoring, and it's just that we have to sync our Gradle project since we added those imports. So let's go ahead and sync, and we'll give this just a moment. And after a bit of Gradle sync magic, we can Alt-Enter and take a look import. Now it knows where to find it, so we simply had to do a Gradle sync. By the way, what is serialized name? Well, that's something I was just referencing, which is what if, instead of having this ID, which matches exactly our JSON, what if we did leave it as plant ID? Well, then we could use that at serialized name annotation, and we pass in ID, just like so. And what that means is, go ahead, Alt-Enter. What that means is, just one moment, as we Alt-Enter and include that, there we go. What that means is that the attribute name is plant ID, but map it to a name-value pair where the name is ID in JSON. So this is simply a mapping in case maybe you're dealing with a legacy class where the attributes don't exactly match what's in JSON. You can use the serialized name annotation to make that happen. So in any case, in this case, we have our plant list, which is a collection of plant DTOs. You see our constructor has that set up as the only attribute, an attribute called plants, which is of type list, and the list contains plant DTOs. So that's our very highest level object. That is going to contain, in our case, about 63 plant DTO objects, or if we got the entire catalog of plant objects, it would be almost 5,000 plant objects that are available from that string. So DTO, and then we know that serialized name is a mapping from the JSON name value pairs to the attributes that we have in our DTO. Next thing we need is an interface called RetrofitClientInstance. And in this case, we define the base URL that we want to hit, and we also have a little factory method. You might remember factory methods when we talk about design patterns. But we have essentially a factory method that will get us a retrofit instance. I could type this all from scratch, but I'm going to use a little shortcut because this is boilerplate code. This is something that you can mostly copy-paste with a few adjustments. And also it lets me show you something that's kind of neat about Kotlin, which is there's a way to automatically convert from Java to Kotlin. We've already written a class, or an interface rather, very similar to this in Java, so we can simply borrow it and put it into Kotlin. So first, let's go back to our IDE. And this is the retrofit client instance that I created in a previous Java program. So what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to copy, we'll go ahead and copy a lot of this here. And then I'm going to go back to our project that we're currently using. So plant places Kotlin. And I'm going to right click. And watch what I do here. This is very interesting. I'm going to say new Java class. We'll call this one Retrofit Client Instance. Now notice I said Java, not Kotlin. This is a nice trick if you find some solution on GitHub or Stack Overflow or any of those websites and it's in Java, but you're doing a Kotlin-based project. Go ahead and paste it in as Java. Yeah, that's fine. And we'll do a little paste magic here. Go ahead and settle our imports. So just some source code I've copied from somewhere else. Note it does not have the little Kotlin indicator here, so it is indeed a Java class. I save, but now I go to Code, Convert Java File to Kotlin File. So it's going to take my Java code here and it's going to convert it into Kotlin syntax. And to be honest, I could leave it. It is possible to have a project that has both Kotlin and Java in the same place. So that's perfectly acceptable, but nonetheless, we'll go ahead and choose OK. And there's only one thing it's a little bit nervous about, and that is this retrofit is nullable, but the method signature for retrofit instance does not have the question mark. So let's add the question mark to indicate that this is a nullable type. Now, one thing that's interesting, you notice that not only did it convert from Java to Kotlin, but it actually converted it as an object in Kotlin, not a class. Many times in Kotlin, we use an object when we have something that is entirely static. So object is just a different type. It essentially means everything in here is static, and that's quite fine. This is essentially a static method, if you will. It's kind of like a factory, so that's okay to be static. So now we have our retrofit client instance. I'm going to go back to GPSAplant, and I can put a few finishing touches on this so that we can actually parse our JSON data. So I go to the onCreate method, which is where everything starts up. And now I'm going to say retrofit client instance. Remember that guy? We just made that retrofit client instance. And then I'm going to invoke that retrofit instance. Let's take a look. This retrofit instance, it's kind of like a variable, but you see it's kind of like a variable that has a getter method as well. And you see by doing that convert Java to Kotlin, it overrode that get method and put some special logic in there. So it's kind of like a traditional Java bean. It's just added some additional logic to the get method to essentially make this a singleton type. So there will only be one retrofit instance at a time. Nonetheless, that all happened behind the scenes. And like I said, it's kind of boilerplate, which is why I'm not looking at every nook and cranny here. So we go back, retrofit instance.retrofit instance, and now we say question mark because we know that could be null, and then we say dot create. Now, the create is a little bit interesting because we need to call something that's going to do some work. We need to call some kind of method that's going to make this all happen. And for that, we actually have to make a new interface that Kotlin, or Retrofit rather, will implement behind the covers for us. So I'm going to, I hate to keep working while I have a red line, so give me just one moment. I'm going to comment this out. And we'll right-click, and I'm going to say new, and we'll say Kotlin file or class, and then we'll say interface. And this one we're going to say get plant service. Now remember what an interface is. An interface is only a list of methods. It's not their implementations. Although in Java 8 you can give a default implementation. So let's say fun, so function, get all plants, no parameters required, returns call, and then plant list. So call is a retrofit class, so we'll say import call, just like so. And then plant list, remember what plant list is. That's an attribute that we made earlier, or sorry, a data class that we made earlier that contains a list of all of the plants that we have parsed from this JSON instance. So we'll go ahead, Alt-Enter, and we'll import plant. And one more thing, we need to add an annotation on top of here. So at get, and now what's the annotation going to say? We'll go ahead and import like so. Well, this one's a little tricky. We go to retrofit client instance, and remember this base URL, plantplaces.com. Okay, back to our interface here, where we have the get annotation. That's going to be everything that comes after plantplaces.com that gives us an absolute path to the URL where we can find this JSON. In other words, take a look at the JSON that we have here. This is that root URL. In the get method, we want to pass the balance of this, which is essentially the full path that's going to find the JSON. And to make it even better, I'm going to give it E, which means find any plant that has the letter E in it. That's going to be a long list of almost 5,000 plants. But nonetheless, let me go ahead and just grab the tail end of this and Control-C. And let's take this back to our development environment. Now I need to put that in quotes, and boom, like so. And at this point we are all set, so I'll go ahead and choose Save. Now you see we've made an interface. The interface has a method called getAllPlants. We're saying that should return a call which contains a plant list collection. Remember, plant list is a simple DTO that simply contains a collection of plants. A collection of plants is a list where that list contains individual plant DTO objects. So we're kind of walking down a series of logic here. Now with that, I can go back to GPSAplant and I can invoke that method that I just created. So I go to GPSAplant, and in the create, I have to give it a reference to that interface, and the reference is a little bit goofy. I have to say get plant service, class, and then .java. This is just a little bit goofy, but we have to refer to the type get plant service, and this is how we do it in Kotlin. We say, I want to create an object of this type. Now that's kind of weird because getPlantService, as we know, is an interface, not a class. We cannot create an object out of an interface. but what we can do is we can have Retrofit automatically generate a class that implements that interface and then generate an object of that on the fly. A little confusing, but nonetheless, we just have to make sure we have all this wiring set up correctly. Okay, next, we save this. So I put my cursor on create, Control-Alt-Enter. Whoops, sorry. I put my cursor on create, Control-Alt-V, so save to local variable. And let's call this one, we'll call this one service, just like so. Now we'll say service dot what? We'll say service dot get all plants. We'll say service, actually we'll do question mark dot get all plants. Now what in the world is that? Well, get plant service, remember what function we made there. We made a function called get all plants. So now we're getting back a reference of this get plant service. We're storing it in the variable called service, and we're invoking get all plants. Invoking get all plants is going to tell Retrofit to invoke this method get all plants, which means Retrofit needs to reach out to this URL. It's going to take this URL, it's going to tape it to the plantplaces.com. It's going to go there, it's going to find the JSON, and then it's going to parse the JSON. It knows the top level element is this plant list object, and the plant list object contains a collection of the individual plant objects. So that's what's going on in this get all plants call. So let's go ahead and put our cursor on get all plants, Control-Alt-V, and we're going to save the result of this into a plants variable. Okay. We're going to save the result of that into a variable called call, more specifically. Okay, a few more lines to go. Now, that's going to go out and make this call to the JSON feed. In the background, it's going to put it on a separate thread, which we know we have to do network operations on a separate thread anyway. It's a good idea because it keeps our user interface responsive. Now, how do we hear back, though? We hear back by doing a callback. So for a callback, we're going to say call dot, I'll tell you what, let's do call question mark dot, because call could be null, call question mark dot enqueue. Now in queue, you see we have a method call here. We're going to declare an inline anonymous inner class. So I'm going to say object colon, and then we're going to say callback plant list, just like so. It's kind of giving me a hint here. This is one of those things that's kind of difficult to explain until I actually do it. So let me go ahead and say callback plant list, just like so. And then we're going to do open curly and close curly. And I'm going to Alt-Enter and say import retrofit callback. And then we'll Alt-Enter once again and we'll import our plant list. Now notice that object is redlined. I Alt-Enter and I choose implement members. And I'm going to select both of these. There we go. Now, this is where I say it's a little easier to explain after I've done that little bit. What we're doing is we are making this call to parse the JSON. But then when we hear back, once the JSON is parsed, Retrofit is going to call us back either in this onFailure method or in the onResponse method. So onResponse if it was successful, onFailure if something went wrong. Let's take a look at both of these. For onFailure, we probably ought to bring up a toast, something like toast.makeText, and then we'll say GPS of plant .this, and then error reading JSON, and then toast.lengthlong, and show. Some kind of message we can show to say, hey, something didn't go right. Okay. Now, that, in hindsight, that first argument is a little bit goofy because we have to reach out to the enclosing class. Doesn't make a lot of sense. I'm going to swap this out for application context just as a property. There we go. We're in good shape. Probably ought to snap a breakpoint there in case something goes wrong. Now let's take a look at onResponse. Let's take away the message there. And notice that we get an argument here called response. That's what contains our parsed JSON. And by parsed, I mean it's taken the JSON, it's cut it up into pieces, it's saved it into some objects. We can get those objects by invoking body and then Control-Alt-V, and we will save that into a variable called body. And now I'm going to say body, and then we'll say question mark dot in plants. Now, wow, what's that? What is body anyway? Well, remember what this is going to return. It's going to return an object of type plant list. And what is the only attribute that we have in this class called plant list? we have one attribute and it's called plants. So if we go back to GPS a plant, you see what's happening in this onResponse. We have requested some JSON up above. We've asked Retrofit to go find it. OnResponse means it found it successfully, so it's returning to us that response is a plant list object. To get the body, we're getting out that plant list object that we created earlier. Okay, so body question mark plants, we can save that into a variable if we want. So Control-Alt-V, and we'll save that into a variable called plants. Now let's confirm that we have indeed received all the plants that we wanted. We'll just do a quick check. We'll do a quick check by doing plants.size. And that'll give us a little gut check. So we'll say var size equals plants.size. Use the question mark again to indicate that this is nullable. I'll snap a breakpoint here, and let's see what it looks like when we run. You see the emulator's running. It's starting to draw the screen. That indicates that we're in the onCreate method. So let's watch here. It's starting by kicking off the retrofit service. Now it's kicking off that call. Now what's going to happen is I'm going to choose F9 here, which means just proceed. Continue with what you were doing. So I press F9 and I quickly bring over the application and you see the screen renders. After the screen renders, there's a slight delay and then we come to onResponse. Let's F8 through onResponse a little bit now, and this means that Retrofit has gone out, it has looked at the JSON, it has parsed it into a series of objects, and onResponse means we have the objects back. Now take a look here, response.getBody, we see body is a plant list. Let's expand on body and we see plants. There are 4,909 plants, so I can expand on this and let's take a look. Plant number 0 is Whopper Red with Bronze Leaf Begonia. You see plant ID is 3121. Now I point that one out in particular because if you remember, the JSON itself calls that ID, but remember we use that @serialized_name annotation that says map the JSON field ID to the attribute plant ID. Now, what I'm going to do is, we know that I started this with oak, but let's go ahead and do what we did in the application, which is, let's look for any plant that has the name E or has the letter E in it. And that'll take just a moment, but look at the very first plant that appears. Begonia, Whopper Red with Bronze Leaf. Now, if we go down a little bit, we'll see some abelia, some fragrant abelia, glossy abelia, so on and so forth, around that 12, 13, 14. Let's take a look again at our debugger, and we see here 0, but let's go on down to maybe 15. We see European silver fir, that's an Abies, Little Richard glossy abelia, a trifolia abelia, fragrant abelia. So several Pinky Bells abelia, several of these things that you see here did come from, as a matter of fact, all of them came from the JSON that we saw earlier. Now, we pulled out the plants, we put them into this variable called plants. So we pulled them out of the plant list and we put them into this variable called plants. This is an array list of 4,909 elements, which are all the plants returned if we look for just the letter E. We can see this in the debugger. By looking at this, we see plant size equals 4909. So at this point, we have successfully reached out, grabbed the JSON, and we have parsed it into a series of plant DTO objects. So in summary, what we need to remember is we need to make a DTO that looks a lot like the JSON that we pulled up here. So we need to make a DTO that represents each of these individual items. In our case, we also need to make some kind of DTO or some kind of data class that holds the collection of all items. We need to do our getPlant service, which is a quick and dirty interface, which just has this method, getAllPlants, a method which we'll call from our onCreate method like we see here. We also need this little factory, RetrofitClientInstance. That's essentially a bit of boilerplate except for things like the base URL. And we know we also need to add internet permission to Android manifest. So with all of that and a little bit of magic with some callbacks in our activity, we're able to use Retrofit to parse JSON and then consume it in our Android application. In our next video, we'll see how we can use this JSON, or this JSON that we parsed into some objects. We'll see how we can use that to feed an autocomplete text view. I look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.